President S.R. Nathan, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, the Chief Economic Advisor of the Government of India, directors from the IIM Institutes, the Provost of SMU, distinguished speakers, distinguished guests, and of course, distinguished alumni. My name is Sharanjeet Lail. I'm an international news journalist from BBC News, and I'll be your MC for the day. Now, of course, for many of you who were here on the first day, you're familiar with the drill. Here we are at IIMP's New Frontiers, and it's going to be a very exciting day full of very distinguished panelists, all of whom are from this incredibly distinguished school. And of course, our very first speaker is what you're all here for, bright and early, 9 a.m. on a Saturday, and he needs a very little introduction. He's the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, the youngest ever and first Asian Chief Economist of the International Monetary Fund, a well-known economist and author and professor for many years at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. He'll be talking about India's re-emergence, after which we'll have a Q&A session. Now, of course, for many of you who were here on the first day, you'll be familiar with the technology that we're using in order for you to get your burning questions to our special guest. So if you could do that again with the pigeonhole technology, if you have a tablet or some kind of device, please start thinking of your burning questions to ask Dr. Rajan. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Raghuram Rajan.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. Lots of good friends in the audience, but I think this is the first of its kind, and I hope it will be the first of many of its kind. We do need to bring together the IIM fraternity on more occasions, and as we just heard, it is a very powerful brand. Well, President Nathan and fellow IIM alumni, first, thanks for having me here. What I want to talk about this morning is a couple of things, and typically they say one theme in a talk. I actually want to talk about two themes. The first part is why India has slowed and how it is recovering. So that's sort of an immediate theme. Lots of people in the financial sector here. I want to try and describe what we're doing there. But I also want to talk about a larger theme, which is the second part, which is how India's story, which is being written even as we speak, is unique. That of a large country growing out of poverty through free enterprise, even while being fully democratic. And I want to emphasize being fully democratic. So I want to argue that in this process we can't focus just on growth, we also have to focus on nurturing democracy. And in some sense they both complement each other. One of the reasons I think we're turning around is partly because of the effects of a democratic process. And if the story of India concludes happily, and I have every confidence that it will, it offers an example for many poor countries around the world of how growth and democracy can be mutually supportive rather than antagonistic. And that is the theme I want to end with. But let me first start with a more immediate theme: why has India slowed? Now, to some extent, for a country as poor as India is, and we are still a poor country, growth should be what Americans call a no-brainer. It's largely a matter of providing public goods, decent governance, decent security of life and property, basic infrastructure like roads, bridges, ports, and power, as well as access to education and basic healthcare. Now that's quite a list, but it doesn't require rocket science to provide it, and then you let people run. You let entrepreneurs like the ones we see here, the business leaders run, and you get growth. Now, fortunately, in addition to everything that I've already mentioned, unlike many poor countries, India has a very strong managerial class, many of whom are represented here, and a number of large world-class corporations that can be enlisted in this effort to produce strong growth. So, I think the question really has to be asked again and again, despite all these benefits, why have we slowed? From the nearly 10% growth which we had in 2010-11, the 8% that we had over the decade from 2002 to 2012 to 5% today. Was the past growth an aberration? And I will argue the answer is no. There are two important reasons, I think, why we have slowed in the last 2 years. The first is, to some extent, we grew too fast in the years before the global financial crisis. Not that we're not capable of growing that fast, but we probably were not fully prepared for that kind of growth. Let me give you a concrete example. Growth needs new factories, new mines. New factories, new mines need land. But land is often held by small farmers or inhabited by tribals who neither have clean or clear title to land, nor the capabilities, informational, knowledge, savvy, to deal on equal terms with the developer or a corporate acquirer. So not surprisingly, as we had very strong growth, farmers and tribals often felt treated unfairly as savvy buyers purchased the land for a pittance. Often these were middlemen reselling it later to corporations for a fortune. And having lost their primary means of livelihood, the compensation the poor farmer or the tribal got didn't last long as development pushed up the local cost of living. The point here is that strong growth tests the capacity of institutions to cope. And India's economic institutions were found lacking. Our land titling was fragmented, the laws governing land acquisition dated from the 19th century, the process of rezoning land for industrial use was non-transparent. Now, in a vibrant democracy like India's, as the economic system starts failing, the economically weak try to find other ways of compensation, and the political system starts kicking in. Unlike in some other countries where the rights of the farmers or the tribal have never stood in the way of development, in India, politicians and NGOs took up the cause. Land acquisition became progressively difficult. Similar story repeats itself elsewhere. For example, the government's inability to allocate resources such as mining rights or spectrum in a transparent way led the courts to intervene and demand change. Now, you can look at the glass as half empty, saying this was misgovernance, corruption, and so on. You can look at it as half full. India's institutions responded and said, we need change, we need more transparency. Now, in the short run, this creates dislocation, this creates problems. For example, as the bureaucracy got hauled up by the courts, so very limited upside from taking decisions, and many downsides. Now, many of you know that in India, there's a plethora of rules, and it is usually helpful to have a helping hand from the bureaucracy to navigate those rules. Not without any misintent, but really just because there are so many of those rules and many of them don't really apply. Now, once the bureaucracy backed off from helping, it led to a greater clogging up of the system. So in a sense, the first reason for slowing growth is our economic institutions could not cope with the strong growth of the past. We had reached the limits of our old institutions. And political checks and balances kicked in to prevent further damage, to prevent environmental despoilation of a kind which should not be recovered. These institutions kicked in. I think that's the good part. And of course, our challenge going forward is to make sure that the institutions start working, that we reform the institutions in a way that allows us to grow once again. And I will come to that in a minute. The second big reason is something we share with many other emerging markets, and it has to do with the global financial crisis. Now, as the crisis hit, a lot of emerging markets saw their markets in industrial countries disappear and saw an abrupt fall in growth. And encouraged by the IMF, by the G20 and others, we injected, along with others, an enormous amount of monetary and fiscal stimulus. And as the industrial countries recovered, it looked like this was the right medicine because we had a cyclical recession and a recovery which was driven by stimulus. If you remember, 2010, 2011, countries around the world enjoyed a spectacular recovery. But what happened was the industrial countries slipped back into difficulty, especially in Europe, beset by fiscal, sovereign debt and banking problems, and they slowed once again. And to some extent, at that point, we found in emerging markets that we had tackled the wrong problem. To replace the collapsed demand from industrial countries, we had all collectively stimulated domestic demand. But domestic demand doesn't necessarily fall on the same goods that the industrial countries demanded. So the goods that were locally demanded were already in short supply before the crisis, and the net effect was, even while we did get enough growth because our foreign markets collapsed, domestic markets, in a sense, started overheating. We had asset price booms and inflation across the emerging world, to tackle which we've had to tighten policy, whether it is in Brazil, which is starting to see very high levels of inflation, or Russia, or even China, where credit booms are the big concern. In India, inflation, and to some extent, problems in the financial market, in the banking sector, have been reasons for tightening. So, in India, you have this, overheating as evidenced by inflation, and you have the policy reaction. That comes over and above the other slowing, which I've already talked about, the slowing of investment. So even as growth is slowing because investment is not picking up, the central bank has to raise interest rates to prevent higher levels of inflation, and so both come together to slow India down. Now, the picture thus far seems very gloomy, but this is where I think a democracy responds. It can't really go off track for long, because ultimately the forces in it bring things back. Adversity, in many ways, generates the solution. So, in the short run, we got some political space in India to do some of the things that are needed. And what are the things that are needed? We need to improve supply, which means investment rather than consumption. And we have to do it by creating transparent institutions and processes that will limit future political problems and misgovernance. Now, using these new institutions, we have to fix problems. The most immediate problems in India today center around energy, coal and gas. For without energy, we don't have power. Without power, we don't have growth. The issues here are important. I wouldn't say they're easily fixed, but we are in the process of fixing them. And importantly, they are resolvable, and if we do resolve them, we can provide coal and gas supplies to the many power projects that are on the verge of completion, we solve many problems. India could have plentiful power and much stronger growth in the coming years. Many of the emerging bad loan problems in the banking sector are cleaned up because many of them have to do with some of these projects that are stuck. And of course, we get much stronger sentiment emerging in the economy, which we could set goals forward. Now, I said things are underway. Of course, we need more coordination and better implementation within the government to ensure that projects, when started, are finished on time. But there are already structures underway, such as the Cabinet Committee on Investment, which are trying to remove the impediments to large projects. The Cabinet Committee on Investment has already cleared about 70,000 crores worth of projects in the first 3 meetings. Hopefully, the pace of meetings is going to pick up, and we will clear many more that are stalled. Importantly, a large number of projects that have been stalled by a number of ministries for a variety of reasons are also being cleared by them without going up to the CCI, perhaps in part because the CCI is exercising some disciplinary effect. For example, a number of projects in environment have also been cleared more recently. Now, in addition to more investment, we need less consumption and more savings. Now, the government has taken an important step by tightening its own budget and spending less especially on distortionary subsidies. We've increased diesel prices, something which required political courage for the government, but has been done and hasn't been tampered with. Households also need to be incentivized to save more, and a fall in inflation will help. So, if all goes well, and we could go on, but I want to break off to the second theme. If all goes well, India should recover from its growth slowdown and go back. I don't see 8% as being a ceiling. I think if we get our institutions right, India could grow at Chinese rates of growth, 11, 12%. We certainly have the capacity to do that if we take the right actions. Now, just to give you a flavor of what is possible, what is coming, the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, which is a project with Japanese collaboration, entails over $90 billion in investment, and it aims to link Delhi to Mumbai, covering a length of 1483 kilometers, passing through 6 states. This project aims to have 9 mega industrial zones with lighter regulation so that you can actually set up businesses fairly easily in those zones. High-speed freight lines, 3 ports, 6 airports, a 6-lane intersection-free expressway connecting our political capital to our financial capital, and a number of power plants, including a 4,000 megawatt power plant. Now, when you look at the boost to economic activity that was created in India by the Golden Quadrilateral highway system, the possibilities from the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, and we're thinking of a number of additional corridors there on the anvil now, Mumbai-Bangalore, Bangalore-Chennai, these are already under planning. There is a tremendous possibility if we get things underway. And as far as the Delhi-Mumbai goes, most of the land acquisition has already been done, so that's no longer a constraint. And the idea is that it will be completed by 2017. That's a massive boost to activity. So my sense is that the institutional change we are undertaking is overdue, but for example, the greater transparency in the allocation of contracts that is underway will create a more level playing field, both for domestic players and for foreigners, and this will be good both for India and for the world. So, to some extent, repeating what the Prime Minister said in a speech on Wednesday, we should not be overly gloomy on the Indian economy. If you look at Indian growth, it sort of goes on, and if you look at the Sensex, it fluctuates wildly around that central tendency of Indian growth. Fluctuating waves of sentiment have historically washed against the economy, even as it chugs along at a steady pace. We should pay heed to sentiment, and we are paying heed to sentiment, but we shouldn't be overwhelmed by it. We have a book out there which says India grows at night. I think that's actually mischaracterizes it. India is actually growing all the time, but more imperceptibly. Things are happening. I mean, if you look at the last few days, Adani Power got some of its issues dealt with by the regulatory authority. You had sugar being cleared, being set free in a sense by the government. People keep asking me about my financial report on the financial sector and say, why hasn't anything been done? And I tell them so many things have been done off that report, yet you don't notice it because they were done at 6-month, 1-year intervals, and you don't pick up the fact that in fact a substantial portion gets done. India grows, not in one spectacular burst, but at a steady pace. Now, this is not where I want to end the talk. I do want to talk about the bigger picture, which is that the central piece of our growth is how it is growing along with a strong democracy. And we have to keep asking the question, how do we achieve a stable balance between the economics and the politics, between free enterprise and democracy? Central to India's story is that it is trying to lift its citizens out of poverty even while they have full democratic rights. A number of other large countries have achieved growth, have achieved success in recent years. I'm not talking about the 19th century, the industrial countries, but emerging markets. They've achieved success, but typically with much more authoritarian governments. And we're doing it with democracy. Now, there is a fundamental commonality between democracy and free enterprise. Both guarantee participation to all, but neither guarantees power or success. Instead, political and economic entrepreneurs basically try and persuade the public that their way is the right way or their product is the best one. And then collective choice, whether by the electorate or the marketplace, determines success. And if your policies or your product starts failing, democracy and the markets push you out. In some sense, if you think about the strength of the Indian change in recent months, that reflects that process where as we find that the old policies are not working, there emerges a momentum for a new direction. Now, these similarities can be pushed too far, that democracy does differ from the markets and that democracy treats individuals as equals, with every adult getting an equal vote, whereas free enterprise empowers individuals based on how much income they generate and how much property they own. So, given this, there is an inherent tension between systems which you have to continuously try and manage, which is a well-off majority could vote to dispossess the rich and the successful. The soak the rich policies that many were advocating before this budget are well possible. And the rich, through their money power, could in turn erode the political rights of voters. So there is a delicate balance so that neither overwhelms the other. And if they do, it could be problematic. So why do we have this balance in countries around the world? And one reason why there is this balance, why the median voter agrees to protect the property of the rich, even though he or she is not rich, is perhaps because they see this as a more efficient system, that the rich have got there by managing the property better, and to the extent that they're self-made, they have come out winners in a competitive, fair and transparent market, perhaps they're better allowed to manage their wealth, while society gets a fair share both through employment as well as through taxes. However, in a world where the rich are seen as idle, incompetent or crooked, and this is where the imagery or the message of the 1% movement is problematic, it sends the message that these people don't deserve their wealth, then the median voter should be willing to vote for tough regulations and punitive taxes on them. Now, to see a country where this has gone to an extreme, think about Russia. Russia today, property rights don't enjoy widespread support, popular support, because so many of the oligarchs have become wealthy perhaps through dubious means. So they grew rich, it is perceived popularly, because they managed the system, not because they managed their companies better than anyone else. And so when the government went after a rich oil tycoon like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, very few voices in Russia were raised in protest. Lots of voices across the world, but not in Russia, because these guys did not have popular support. And this creates a more detrimental problem because as the rich no longer find that they have the legitimacy of their wealth, that wealth cannot be used to act as a check and balance against the government. In the United States, somebody like Adelson, who's I think quite famous here, a casino magnate, can spend many millions fighting against the government in power. And he's confident that his property is protected. Can't do that in Russia because there is no sense that is possible. And so a strong check of people against the government, a strong check on the government disappears, a strong check on official arbitrariness disappears. And so the fact that Russia is moving more towards authoritarian kinds of politics is not, I think, coincidental. It's a function of the fact that their rich don't have legitimacy either. Now, by contrast, in conditions of fair and transparent competition, I think there's much more legitimacy. And so one sort of necessity for the democratic support to be extended to the free enterprise system, to the property rights system, is that this system be seen as competitive and efficient, not just allocating rewards to the well-connected, but instead allocating to the bright and capable. A second reason, and this is where I want to come to India, is that most people should believe they have a reasonable shot at success in the free market. And this obviously is not a given in a poor country like India. A poor child today growing up in an Indian village with bad nutrition, indifferent teachers in government schools, and limited access to the kind of learning opportunities that are available in a modern city, starts life at a very, very different point than many of us who've grown up in much different circumstances. Now, a certain amount of inequality in circumstances is inevitable, but if it's too much, it breeds resentment of the system. Why would the poor, for example, vote for expanding free enterprise, for expanding competition, for expanding FDI, for more good jobs in finance and services when they know they simply are not good enough to get one themselves? Why not instead vote for the traditional politician who promises patronage and sometimes even delivers on his election promise? The point here is that to obtain democratic support, you need the first condition, which is enterprise should be seen as clean and competitive, but also most people in the country should see themselves as having a reasonable chance of doing better. Growth, in many ways, should be seen as inclusive. If the rewards are excessively skewed, or they feel they have little chance of getting them, the system loses democratic legitimacy. And here, the government has to play a very important role. It has to make the system fair. That's the first part of my talk, both in appearance and actuality. But second, it has to ensure that masses have the ability to participate on equal terms. Now, there's a very fine line here. You have to give them the ability to participate, but if you go beyond that to determine who wins and who loses, you sort of determine the outcomes in the system, then that becomes problematic. It often becomes inefficient. It allows, to some extent, the political vote to dominate the economic vote. At the same time, you can't also let money power dominate outcomes. So there's a balance here that has to be got at. So to conclude, let me talk about the possibilities that we've seen emerging across the world as the skewness in these processes emerges, and then talk about where India is and why I see hope. If you look at what's happening around the world, Mexico, there's a tremendous fight going on in Mexico today for the soul of Mexico. President Peña has taken on the corporatist interests in Mexico by cutting the telecom barons down to size and by arresting the head of the teachers' union. Mexico previously had been captured by the incumbents, which is why it had halted at middle-income growth. Now, if they can break loose, Mexico has a tremendous future ahead, and we should be watching that process with tremendous interest. So one set of policies that could emerge is what had emerged in Mexico in recent years, capture by the big industrialists, by the trade unions, and that's problematic. They're fighting that. The second set of policies is soak the rich or socialist policies. You see echoes of that very strongly in France, where the entrepreneurs labeled as parasitic and exploitative, and levels of taxes at 75% have been contemplated. Now, France is in the midst of discovering how dangerous and costly these policies are, especially as industrialists leave. So, corporatist policies, socialist policies, and you could also have populist policies, where the dominant elite tries to buy off those falling behind with stuff such as cheap credit and free consumer goods. In some sense, you could argue that the US, before the crisis, was in a populist mode with very cheap credit expanding very widely, and that was in many ways intended to assuage the anger of those falling behind. Now, when you carry these policies to an extreme, and I'm not saying these countries are carrying them to an extreme, but they could lead to much worse outcomes. Corporatist policies, as we know, in Germany led to fascism. Socialist policies led to communism in a number of countries around the world, and comparative populism leads to economic crisis and chaos. Now, you can see echoes of all these three possibilities in India today. But I'm confident that we will avoid these three outcomes, and that we will emerge in a middle ground where democracy and free enterprise are not antagonistic, but they actually reinforce each other. First, on the level playing field that I think is necessary, as I said, we are trying to change our institutions. Our democratic institutions are forcing the change. The CBC, the CAG, the Supreme Court, they're all bringing or attempting to bring more transparency. That, to my mind, is a good thing in India. But also, we are a very open economy that is helping keep the playing field competitive. Few people know that India's sum of trade, that is exports plus imports to GDP, is almost 50%. That is a very, very open economy. We have a strong and a strengthening competitive commission, which actually is asking questions not just of private sector enterprises, but of public sector enterprises, in starting to demonstrate it. In other words, even as we mourn the deterioration of some older institutions, new institutions are springing up in India to create the kind of economic structure that we want. We're also, as you know, working to make growth more inclusive. But I would emphasize that in this process, we need to focus not as much on handouts, but on creating better jobs. As the Prime Minister has said many times now, a good job is the best form of inclusion. And we have to equip our poor to become better, more empowered to equip themselves with the needed capabilities so that they and their children can become effective contributors to the economy. And I think the benefit transfer system, the system of cash transfers, targeted cash transfers, is the best way to empower the poor, to give them choice, to allow them to command respect when they take their money to the shop, rather than to command disdain when they are forced to be supplicants from some sort of structure set up by a remote government. Now, giving them choice also allows them to choose what they want to buy to best equip themselves. Yes, you can lament about some of that buying perhaps not being in the best interest of the poor, but we should trust them to make the right decisions, and often that trust is not misplaced. We also must remember that as we are trying to equip the poor, the line between equipping them to get more and better jobs and populist vote buying is a very thin one, and we must be careful not to cross that. Now, at the same time as we need to equip the poor, we also need the rich to play their part by providing some of the resources. Now, in India, we don't need to raise the tax rate to get those resources. We need more of the people who are actually making money to pay the taxes that they owe. The finance minister mentioned the sum of 42,800 people who declare an income over 1 crore in India. That's $180,000. You just have to take a trip around Gurgaon or some of the affluent parts of Delhi to realize that the number of people making that kind of income is way, way above the ones who declare. And so we have to broaden the tax base. We don't want to increase the tax rates in India, and we refrain from doing that in a substantial way in the budget, precisely because broadening the tax base is a more effective, efficient form and will also lead more people to have a sense of participation which they should feel. And I could again go on about the changes that will make this possible. Information technology is helping. We now know who buys what, who gets what. It gives us an ability to go after people who owe their taxes and ask them why they haven't paid without being without harassing unduly. So let me end with, we can take these reasonable and feasible steps. And I'm confident that as a result, Indian free enterprise and democracy will reinforce each other. And I want you to think about the kind of role that a self-assured India, brimming with ideas and energy, can play in this world. It will offer an alternative view of development, one combining free enterprise with democracy, bringing together cutting-edge companies with bottom-of-the-pyramid services. We can teach the West and the rest, even while learning from them, as we did in the historical past, when we were a global broker for ideas. We could be a voice for good in the international arena. I think people like you in this room have an enormous role